Good morning, Dan and Amy, coming to you live from SVM in Arlington Heights, part of our AM 560 Signature Bank Business Tour. And, we talked to our friends, Diamond and Silk, earlier in the show, Amy. And
I'm still upset by our conversation because I'm upset what's happening to them. Facebook said deem them unsafe and have yanked them.
Not near as upset as they are, which is great that they're fighting back. But remember Candace Owens, Red Pill Black?
Oh, yeah.
We've had her on the show before.
I watched that.
She was on with John Stossel recently, and she had some good things to say. Again, people that are speaking out and fighting back and providing a different perspective that goes against the caricature that the D.C. press corps wants to make of the black community and the orthodoxy of opinion, political opinion within the black community. But here's something that she said that I had trouble with, and this is a problem kind of with the young and the old, no matter what demographic you're discussing. Candace Owens talking about the black conservatives who preceded her.
And I think why some of these black conservatives have not been successful in the past is because they cared too much about what people thought. We're doing it differently. We are talking a lot of trash. We are very sassy.
The African American community is suffering from a poor memory.
We want people to know you can feel free to call me an Uncle Tom. You can feel free to call me an Auntie Tom. It does not affect me. Do you want to know why? Because I actually read the book, and Uncle Tom was the hero.
Yeah, I like the fearlessness and the sassiness as she describes it, but the idea that the likes of Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell and Bob Woodson and Shelby Steele were too concerned about what people thought about them. That's why they were, quote-unquote, unsuccessful. In point of fact, I'd suggest that Candace Owens read some of the other books about the history of what those black conservatives did during Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights era, and for the last 50 years in fighting this fight and providing the intellectual firepower, not just for black conservatives, but for conservatism generally. It's annoying to me when people who just got on the scene think they have a thought that nobody else has ever thought. They're doing something nobody else has ever done. As Truman said, there's nothing new in this world. It's just the history we don't know, and you're more effective if you recognize that. So a little lesson to some of our allies that maybe are sometimes as impetuous as they are sassy. And with that, it's a perfect transition to one of those forefathers that I just mentioned. He is Shelby Steele. He is the author of numerous books and often talked about on our show. The latest book is Shame, How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country. And Shelby Steele, who now, because, we talked to Eli Steele, his son.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
How Jack Became Black, his documentary. Now, instead of calling Eli Steele the son of Shelby Steele, we call Shelby Steele the father of Eli Steele. Right, Shelby?
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a native South Sider, and you've addressed the issue of violence in black neighborhoods and urban centers, generally speaking, and Chicago specifically, and you did so recently on Laura Ingram's show. And so I suppose we should start there because, of course, violence still afflicts the neighborhood you grew up in, the region you grew up in, the south side of Chicago and the west side as well, just Chicago generally. And how you compare that to the attention paid, say, for example, with respect to that police-involved shooting in Sacramento a couple of weeks ago.
Well, what's interesting is that these shootings, Trayvon Martin, I guess, was one of the first, Michael Brown, and there are many others at this point, and they're all there's this sudden explosion in the culture. What does this mean? And there's this sort of angst that comes out. While the statistics say that in the year 2016, 762 largely black boys were killed, murdered, just on the south side of Chicago. Well, to pay attention, there's nothing wrong with paying attention to Trayvon Martin or any of these other incidents, and they should be examined for what they represent, what caused them, so forth. But the issue is of violence inside the black community is so much more profound and so much more devastating. it's just taking away a generation of young people and destroying them. And so, this is. But the point, I think, is, why does this happen? Why the emphasis on one and not on the other? Well, when you're talking about Trayvon Martin, then you're scratching the ground looking for a case to build around his victimization, his racial victimization, because victimization has become power in American life. That I'm a victim is my power in this society. It's what I can claim and gain attention and all sorts of perks and preferences and so forth. It's my power. I have faith, literally have faith, not in myself, but in my victimization. And so when we look out at the world, we duplicate that. A white policeman shooting a black, that's my victimization. That's my power. I like that. I'm going to be excited. I'm going to be on TV. I'm going to rally. But when we're just killing each other on the south side of Chicago, who cares?
Well, what was life? What was Mr. Steele? What was life like for you growing up on the south side of Chicago?
I never really saw a gun, a pistol, till I was probably 17, 18 years old. Didn't mean that we didn't fight. We did a good deal of that. There was a kind of a ritual that we went through, but that boys, I think, universally go through. But there was number one. There was also no breakdown of the family. Every kid in my neighborhood, except I remember there was one family where the husband had died. Other than that, everybody had a father.
Wow. And
everybody knew who that father was, and some were obviously better than others, but they were all fathers, and they were all upholding a certain view of life and demanding that we be responsible, demanding that, despite the fact that we lived in segregation, that we make something of ourselves. And so many of us, we were all very poor, but many of my peers coming out of that community have done very well in life. One owned some department stores in Texas. Another was the head of the FBI for the Western United States. Another is a well-known biology professor at the University of Michigan. These were all people who came up off the South Side and did very well for themselves because they believed their life was in their own hands, and they weren't trying to sell themselves to America as victims. They were trying to sell themselves as competent individuals.
I want to, a piece you wrote for the Wall Street Journal, which is recast in your book, Shame, your latest book, speaks of the culture of deference, and I tagged it as one of the four key op-eds in the 2016 election cycle. This was in November of 2016, if I'm remembering correctly. You wrote this piece. And then I saw a talk you gave at the Heritage Foundation where you talked about Madame Bovary liberalism. And I wonder if you could just connect the dots for us, the Madame Bovary liberalism that led to this culture of deference that sort of afflicts us today, and victimization being a feature of it, as you're describing.
Mm-hmm. It's early in the morning, but I'll go to work.
Okay, sorry. Get those synapses firing.
Yeah. Well, Madame Bovary was one of the first modern characters. She was the novel by Flaubert, Madame Bovary, was one of the very first modernist novels, by which is meant that she was a character who was focused on her own angst and really couldn't see beyond herself. And she was a fundamentally selfish and empty woman who lived in pursuit of one sort of illusion or dream after another. To me, American liberalism in the last 50 years has been Madame Bovary. It has sustained itself with one empty and failed illusion after another. I can remember from school busing, which completely wiped out the American education system, to affirmative action, to to war on poverty programs and the Great Society programs. All of these dreams about how where we sort of think of them as the way to bring black people into some sort of parity with all other human beings. All of them absolutely fail, disastrously fail. Not only do they fail, but they have ruined many of the good things that were once present in black American life. This sort of self-reliance, this struggle against the odds and so forth, and has encouraged instead this sense of dependency and manipulation, where you're constantly using racism as a charge to get whites in line and go along with this program. The other side of this, of course, is whites, and that, I think, is white guilt. And by white guilt, I mean something very specific. White guilt is not real guilt. I don't get up this morning and feel guilty about the Eskimos. I don't expect many Americans to say, oh, my God, I'm waking up this morning, what about all the black people in America? That's not the way human beings and societies work. What happens is, and what has happened in America, is that this idea of black victimization has become so powerful that whites are now terrorized, and there's no other word for it. They are terrorized at the prospect of being stereotyped or stigmatized as a racist. To have that happen to you is to be literally completely marginalized and rendered impotent, and self-hate is the only sort of honorable response to that situation. So white guilt is again what sort of played into Madame Bovary's pathologies and made her modern. But because when you are afraid of being stigmatized like that, you act guiltily, even though you don't feel genuine guilt. Most whites do not feel genuine guilt about black America. That would be a pretty sophisticated thing to feel. And so I don't think that's it. On the other hand, I think whites are absolutely terrified of being seen as a racist and being stigmatized with this old American sin. And so therefore most white Americans today act guiltily toward the black community and are always anguished and always trying to do something and meddle rather than saying, and here's the tragic reality nobody wants to face. Yes, we were profoundly oppressed. It may have been the worst instance of human oppression in all of history. So we were oppressed, but now we are free, and we can do anything we want to do, including be the president. And so we somehow have to stop our reliance, blacks, our reliance on our power of that we have with white people, keeping them in fear of us and keeping them in fear of the stigma that we wield against them, and because then you just get this symbiosis of white guilt on the one hand, black dependence on the other hand, and that's what it seems to me we're stuck in today. Can't seem to get out of it.
All right, that's pretty good for this early in the morning. I'll tell you that. That's the kind of dissertation you get from a Shelby Steele. By the way, white guilt, not just a phrase, also the name of an excellent Shelby Steele book that I've mentioned often on this show as required reading. Shelby Steele is an author. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, longtime academic. His latest book is Shame, How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country. You want to pick that up as well. Shelby Steele, a real pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch.